Hey, how are you? This is John from johnbias.com Scale Models. Thanks so much for watching this video. Today I'm going to be working on the tracks for a Warhammer 40K Rhino armored personnel carrier from Citadel. And this is how everything will look when I'm finished. But I'm going to take you through some very simple steps using acrylic products so that it goes by very fast to get your tracks looking like this and ready to mount on the model for further weathering. When I'm weathering tracks on a Warhammer 40K vehicle, I start off by clipping them from the sprue except for one side. This allows me to handle it easily, paint both sides, and just makes it a little bit, my life a little bit simpler for me. Now, I clip it so that the outside of the track that will be on the outside of the model, that's what's exposed, and I clean up those edges, make sure that they're looking good. Once I clip these off, I can go in and clean up the little nub marks and add a little bit of paint, but because it's on the underside of the model, they're generally not going to be seen, except for the ones coming around over the top. You want to pay a little more attention to those. But I get them clipped off, cleaned up, and I prime them, and I just simply used a Tamiya rattle can primer here to prime the tracks. And the next step, of course, will be putting down the base paint. The next step is going to be painting the tracks. For this, I use 1 part Vallejo model color black gray and 2 parts Citadel lead belcher. The goal here is to come up with dark steely type look. Most of this is not going to be showing because there's going to be so much weathering over the top. So you don't have to use these two. You're just looking for a dark grayish, steelish, maybe a little bit of tan in there, something that will be a good base coat for the tracks. And then I just get a big honking brush like this, and I just go in and I begin roughly painting it. I don't try to be too precious about it. It's a tank and it's going to get dirty, so I just go in and paint it. You could airbrush it. It'll make things go faster. Quite honestly, the reason I'm not airbrushing it is because sometimes I just enjoy brush painting things. But I'll get these painted and we'll go on to the next step. Okay, for the next few steps, I wanted to talk a little bit about the theory of the steps that I'll be doing. On any armored vehicle, the tracks, of course, are going to be metal. They may have some rubber cleats, but there's going to be a state where they're factory fresh. Then as they get worn, in the case of these metal tracks, on top of the metal, there's going to be some scuffing that exposes the under layers of metal, and then there's going to be some rust, and then there would be various oil stains and things like that, and then dirt would go on top of it. So when you're weathering tracks, think about the order of operations, I guess you would say, the order in which things would happen. So there's going to be some abuse to the metal. There's going to be some rust that develops on top of that. There's going to be various stains and other things that happen all at the metal level before any of the mud gets on. So I'm going to try and replicate that in the next few steps. All right, I'm going to use Citadel Runefang steel as a sort of a chipping color. What I'm trying to do here is just emulate, replicate, duplicate, however you want to say it, the scuffs that would happen to the metal as the tank was driving around. For this, I'm going to use a sponge in these clamps, and I've offloaded most of the paint here on a paper towel, and I'm just going to go in and begin dabbing at it like that. Now this is a real subtle step, and a lot of this, 90% of this, is probably going to be weathered over. But I think it gives some nice variation at a very foundational level that, again, sells the notion of the track being used. I don't want to dry brush it on because I don't want to completely cover everything, but I want to give just enough brightness and try and hit in between the tracks if I can, using the edge of the sponge to get some of that color in there. And I'm also going to flip it over and do it along here. You can go especially heavy here because the road wheels and the return rollers, as the tank was moving along, will clean off and scuff up a lot of this surface here. So it's, I guess you'd say this is an optional step, but I like to do it because I think it adds a little bit of character and a little bit of life to the tracks. So hopefully you can see that there. And I'll continue on, get all of these others done, and then move on to adding some more layers of abuse. All right, I've finished all of the spongering, as Lincoln Wright likes to say, and I've got it looking like I want it. I concentrated more along the edges here that will be poking, that will be showing like this, just to give a little bit of contrast there. And again, a lot of this will be covered up, but I want to establish metal scuffs. I want to have multiple layers of things happening at the very basic metal level. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I want to give it a wash. And for that, I'm going to be using Citadel Nuln Oil. Now, the reason I'm going to use this and not something more brown like Agrax Earthshade is I'm looking for contrast here. I'm not looking for dirt necessarily, not yet. That'll be added later. But this is purely for contrast, to make the various parts and the details really show up. All right, to apply this, I'm going to use my big fat brush here. And I'm going to take it straight out of the pot. I'm not thinning it. I'm not trying to be neat about it. I'm just slapping it on like that. And that's really going to help those details pop out. But I'll go ahead and continue on and get this done and give it a little time to dry and move on to the next step. All right, the Nuln oil has mostly dried. There's still some on the bottom that's drying out. But with the Nuln oil on, what we've done here is establish a metallic track with some chipping on it into the deeper metal, I guess you'd say, so it's showing the lighter metallic color. The Nuln oil is simply bringing out the detail. So this is still all, I guess you'd say it's still all metal. We haven't introduced any other colors. Now what I want to do is start the process of adding rust to this. Okay, the first level, I guess you'd say, of rust that we want to add to this is the oldest rust, the parts that have chipped or scraped into the metal and have begun to oxidize and have taken on a very dark appearance. So to do that, I'm going to use Vallejo Chipping Brown, but any dark brown, very dark gray color will work for this. And just like I did for the silver color earlier, I'm going to use a sponge, and I'll get some off on my sponge, unload it onto my paper towel, and what you're wanting to do here, what I'm wanting to do here, is just enhance the chips and the texture that's already there with some additional scrapes and things to represent, like I said, that first layer of rust. It's very subtle. It's not something that really pops out at you from a distance, but when you get up close and start examining it, it really shows a depth of finish that gives the viewer something to really latch on to see that there's several layers of things going on. So I'll continue on all the tracks here, getting these first layers of rust on, and when that's finished, I'll come back and show you where we're going next. All right, I've applied that darker chipping, and let me get it up to the camera. Hopefully you can see that. And it's nothing dramatic, but we've gotten several layers now of scuffing and the beginning of some how do you say that? Oxidization. The beginnings of rust. Yes, the beginnings of rust. We'll just call it rust. That's easier to say. But it's giving it a depth of finish, and a lot of this will disappear, but it's given us a depth of finish as the basis for the continued steps. Now, the next steps will be to add some proper rust washes. And for this, I'm going to use Vallejo model washes. I'm going to use dark rust and light rust. Now, you could certainly use enamels or oils. If you'll notice, this whole process is using acrylics. And I do that because it's a fast method. You can just use a few minutes between steps and in very short order have your tracks looking really good and ready to get on the model for further weathering when you're using acrylics. So you don't have to be you don't have to use acrylics if you prefer enamels or oils. It's just going to extend your drying time. So let me get prepared to do that, and we'll get on to the next step. Okay, I'm going to start the process with this Vallejo Model Wash 76507 Dark Rust. I've added some in my palette here and thinned it 50-50 with water. So I actually put 10 drops of the rust, 10 drops of water, stir it around. And you need to, if you're using acrylic products like this, you need to stir it quite often because the pigment will settle in the bottom of the palette. But all I'm going to do is just take my big old honking brush, and I'm going to go in and slop this on fairly heavily. Acrylic washes, especially when they've been thinned down, tend to dry much more thin looking, much more translucent than they go on. So whatever product you're using, test it a few times and see how it looks different between being wet and dry, but it won't look as stark as it does here in this first application. I'll go ahead and do the rest of the tracks, both sides, and then we'll go on to the next step. All right, I applied the darker rust color, and I used a hairdryer to get it dry a little quicker. And you can see here how it's looking. It almost disappears, but trust me, there's a hint of dark red there, which is establishing that rust. But what I really like that it does, and I hope this will show up on camera, is where I put in those brighter silver chips, they've now been tinted slightly red to really give it more of a rust-ish tone. You can kind of see it here on this one on the end a little bit. But again, it's establishing depth of finish and really trying to sell the notion of well-used, well-worn tracks. So with that step done, the next is going to be putting on some light rust, and again I'm using Vallejo Model Wash. This is 76505. This time I want these rust streaks to be a little more noticeable, so I'm going to use the rust wash unthinned. I'm going to use it right out of the paint pot, and then I'm going to use this liner brush because I want to be a little more deliberate with my application. I don't want to flood it in every area of the track. I want to suggest that this is fresher, brighter rust that is forming in, some areas of the track, but not others, just to keep it kind of random and make it hopefully a little more visually interesting. But I'm really focusing in on the space, especially between the tracks where they join together. though I don't mind if it gets, say, into this area also. So I'll continue on around the tracks in this manner and get some more visible rust on there, and then continue with finishing up these for the model. Okay, I added in that lighter rust between the various portions of the track where they link together, and that brought the rust up just a little bit more, and that focused on the recessed areas. Now the next step that I want to do is to mix about 3 parts Vallejo Model Air Yellow Ochre, 1 part of the light rust wash, and then just a few drops of water to thin it out. The Model Air is already a fairly thin product, as is the wash, so you can see I've mixed it up here, and it'll dry very translucent, but it's easy to work with. What I'm going to do here is I want to suggest another color of rust, but this will be the most, I guess you'd say, the newest rust. And this, I want to focus on just getting it around the raised detail. On the track, there's some recessed detail that represents where the links, the track links join together, and then there's some raised detail, the cleats. So what I want to do is just not necessarily completely around every cleat, but I want to make sure that the majority of the cleats have some of this light rust on them, just to help. Again, this is not only suggesting rust. What we're doing with all of these things is helping the viewer's eye to catch detail, but it's also suggesting things to them. It's essentially inviting them into the reality of the model's world. It's a process called suspension of disbelief. They know they're looking at a plastic model, but by going in and adding in these details and maybe exaggerating them a bit, it helps the viewer, it helps their brain essentially buy the notion that, oh, that's a rusty thing, that's a clean thing, that's a dirty thing, that's metal, that's leather, that's wood, whatever the case may be. So I'm going to continue applying this fairly neatly with my liner brush around these cleats, and once that's done, I'll show you what it looks like. Okay, I've added that lighter yellow color of the rust around the raised areas, and it's sometimes I think I can be more subtle than I need to be. I see it as I look at it on the camera. I don't know that it will really show that much, but it has lightened up the areas around the edges of those recesses. And some, if some gets off in other areas, that's fine, because rust is very random. But I applied it on both sides around the cleats. You can see it a little more right there. It shows up a little more. And that's fine, because that's actually going to be the part that's sticking up that you'll see, although a lot of that's going to have mud and other effects on it later. Now, what has happened? Let me go back over the steps a little bit. We established the metal, the steel base colors. The base color, a little bit of scuffing of it, added some shadows with the non-oil to make sure that stood out. Then we went in and began adding layers of rust. So we've added several layers of that. Now the next step is to do something to replicate how when a tank rolls along on, especially on a road or in a town or on any hard surface like that, it will scrape through to the bare metal. So there will be shiny spots on the surface that makes contact with the road. Even if it's out in the mud, while the mud may cover up part of the tracks, the constant rolling over of limbs and logs and rocks and everything else can scuff that area up. In addition, as the road wheels roll along the track, because that's what they're doing, they're essentially rolling on the track makes its own road, they're going to be scuffing that up and cleaning that, and so that's going to be a little brighter silver, a little more bright than the rest of it around there. Now, the way I want to replicate that and bring that back up is by using this Prismacolor silver pencil. It's their Prismacolor Premium or Premier silver. The number on it is PC949. This is, I believe this is a grease pencil. I don't believe it's a water pencil because once this stuff goes on, it stays on pretty well. But what I want to do here, and the reason I'm doing this instead of sponge chipping is far more random. I want this to be a little more precise so I have a little more control. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go in and in various places bring up the silver along just the very top portion of the cleats. Now some of them you may want to do completely silver, like, you know, maybe I'll pick this one, like in camera range, maybe I'll pick this one right here and do that one fairly silver, and then these others I'll just hit the edges. What you're going for here is something to just suggest that it's been scuffed back down to the bare shiniest metal all along the track like that. And you can do some along where the links are, along the edge, wherever you think it's going to look good. Just go for a random look to it, and it's really going to make the detail pop. It serves to help the viewer's eye, again, as I discussed in the last segment, but it's also just going to replicate what actually happens in the real world. And I'll do this on both sides of the track. So let me get this done and I'll show you what it looks like. All right, I've done the silver pencil along the tracks, and you can see how those look there, hopefully. And on the other side where the road wheels work, I actually ran the pencil along either side of the cleats just to suggest where they would kind of scrub and scrape things and kind of keep it somewhat cleaner. But I'm pretty much ready to call these tracks done and ready to be mounted on the model. Now, if you're saying, well, aren't you going to put mud and all that other stuff on it? Yes, that will come, but this is the process I go through before mounting it on the model. Once it gets on the model, then I put in mud and stains and grease and all of those other things, and it, in conjunction with the road wheels and everything else, I do it all as one unit. I don't weather them with dirt and that kind of thing separately and then put it on the model. I feel like it needs to be done as a unified whole so that it looks like it's supposed to be there. Now, anytime in this process, I could have added more of a wash or less of a wash, added extra steps. If you follow this video in the way I've done it, certainly explore doing it different ways, using different materials. This is just a suggested order of things and some ways of doing it. I've found I like this, but I do vary the application methods and the products that I use from time to time just so I don't get stuck in a rut. But this is something that I've been doing on the last few tracked models that I've built. And I really like the way that it looks because it's a fairly simple method. Aside from the video editing and all of that that's gone along with this, if I would have just done this straight through, this would have taken me about an hour and a half, maybe, especially using the hairdryer to speed things up. So it's a really quick process. All right, to wrap things up, thank you so much for taking time to watch this video, especially if you've watched it this far. I do appreciate that. Be sure and check out my website, www.johnbias.com. I have a presence on YouTube and Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and I'm also on Patreon. All of those links are down below in the description, and I would be grateful if you would check out whatever your favorite social media source is and give me a like or a follow. And if you would like to support the work that I do, then please do follow that Patreon link. There's several levels of rewards, and I would be most grateful if you would consider that. And to those who are my patrons already, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. So I hope you found this useful, and I hope this will give you kind of a basis for experimentation and maybe trying some new things out if you haven't done this before, and get you some tracks that are ready to go on your model and ready to weather. All right, thanks again for watching. Happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.